Okay, everybody. All right, hope everybody's well today. Just a couple of things. I'm going to start taping these in 30-minute segments, and I want to apologize, of course, for the amateurishness of all of this, but to be honest with you, I just do not have much in the way of tech skills. I'm going to turn this viewfinder around so I can see. There we go. Anyway, I'm going to go about 30-minute segments, and I think that's it's primarily because I did this yesterday and my camera ran out while I was taping, and I didn't even know it. But it's also probably good for you. You can just watch a 30-minute segment, of course, and have other things you might want to do, and then come back and watch another 30-minute segment. So that's the way we're going to proceed, okay? All right, so I hope that you guys always probably be good at it before you watch one of these segments that you have made off a copy of the outline for this section. This is Breaking with Britain, of course, and will just help you to kind of just go through the different components of the presentation. Also, probably a good idea to have your study sheet with you too, just to make sure that you're identifying all the potential identifications that are coming down the pike. So hopefully you're having both of these things in hand. And you will see that my process of working through I'll have a lot of little these pieces of paper I'll hold up and stuff like that, and I try to make this thing work, okay? So the whole concept of becoming Americans is that this new people began to emerge, and these new people, of course, became Americans, and I wanted you to know the demographic components of that, the social components, economic, political, cultural manifestations of these people emerging, and it creates someone like Benjamin Franklin who began to perceive the fact that the Americans were a distinct and different people, and the end result of that, is that the Americans are going to increasingly want to go their own way, which leads to the topic of this moment, of course, which is breaking with Great Britain. And my intention is simply to tell you the story of why the Americans broke with Great Britain. You can pretend that this is a sad story if you want, of course, because we all know the breaking up is hard to do, but it's not a sad story for the Americans, right? It's the foundation of this nation that they're going to create for themselves. So anyway, I want to give you a sense of what caused the Americans to begin to seek separation from the British. Now I'm going to start with, in the outline I call this Dysfunctional Colonial Family. So this is a device, I use like a homily just describing people in a way to kind of let us see exactly what happened between the Americans and the British. And so imagine, if you will, a family. And we're going to simplify the family, very simplified to say the least, a parent and a child. Single parent situation is not uncommon, so it's not necessarily something that we're unfamiliar with. But you have to imagine that this parent brings a child into the world. And the parent places the child in this extraordinarily rich environmental setting where the child has everything that it needs. It, of course, is going to have all the food it needs. It's going to have the toys, everything it needs, not only to, of course, survive, but to thrive. Now, in our little story, we have to assume that the child somehow makes it through its infancy. But here's the critical factor. Relatively quickly, as the child begins to grow and develop, the parent begins to neglect the child. The parent basically just leaves the child alone, essentially. And the child, we have to assume again that it can get through those kind of problematic components of infancy, begins to grow and develop. And, because of it's such a rich environment, the child begins to thrive, begins to do very well, to say the least, essentially. And as it grows up, of course, it becomes increasingly sort of, doing things its own way, its own attitudes, its own behaviors. How else can it proceed, of course, because there isn't much in the way of a parental interaction in kind of way. So anyway, that goes on, and the child does really well. The child begins to grow and develop and strengthen itself. And anyway, we come along to the moment where the child's about 18 years of age. So the child actually is no longer really a child. The child is on the cusp of becoming adult. And in that moment, the parent decides to come back into the life of the child. And, all of a sudden the parent decides to be interactive in the child's lifetime. The parent begins to institute rules upon the child. And the parent begins to say, you've got to eat your vegetables, you've got to be home by 10, you've got to floss your teeth, all these kind of things that parents would do. Anyway, just understanding human nature, we know that this child is probably not going to like that, having grown up on their own. So I would argue that the process that will begin to happen is, first, the child will protest against the parent's involvement. Second, if it continues, the child will rebel. And ultimately, the child will seek independence. And so that, writ small, is basically the story of what happened between the Americans and the British. What happened was that, almost immediately after the establishment of the colonies, England began to neglect the colonies. That's just basically the way it was. And you can say that England established the colonies, but we all know that that's not really true. It was groups and people who did that. It was the the Virginia Company. It was the Puritans, the Pilgrims. It was others who the Quakers. They're the ones who established it essentially. And so the English, it's a kind of interesting relationship that they never really are the actors in terms of the creation of the American colonies, but they were generally in control, control of the situation. Anyway, but as soon as the colonies are established, the English are neglecting them. There's no doubt about that. And I want you to know that neglect is not necessarily a bad thing. Historians describe what happened to the colonies as benign neglect. And benign neglect simply means, that this is something that's not necessarily a bad thing. As an adult, I have to tell you that I mostly wanted to be neglected as far as my life is concerned, especially in terms of something like Palomar College. And I have to really thank Palomar College for neglecting me through most of my career. And what that really means is, of course, I was left alone to do what I wanted to do. And I can't tell you how much I appreciate that situation. So, yes, the colonists were neglected, but not in a way that did any damage to the colonists. My cat is stalking me right now. I think she was afraid, didn't understand why I'm talking to a camera. Anyway, so the colonies, and I want you to know why the colonies were neglected. I mean, there's a reason for that. The English were messed up. I mean, there's no other way to describe that. The first 100 years of colonial America is a horrific time for England. And, I'm not a great English historian, but I'll give you just the bare bones of the whole thing. Now, when the colonies were established in the beginning, that was James I, and that seems to go okay pretty much. But then his son is Charles I. And Charles I becomes the king, and I can't tell you all of the particulars in terms of the problems with Charles, but I think he was a little too nice to the Catholics. I think he was fairly aggressive in trying to get the power away from Parliament, and the end result of this was that there began to be some serious conflicts there, and serious enough that they ultimately take Charles I and they chop his head off. He's the one and only English king to suffer regicide. I was walking down the street one day when we were near Trafalgar Square, and there was a plaque up on the wall that said, "This is the site where the execution of Charles I." So a pretty heavy-duty little situation going down there. Anyway, it's an act of regicide. And what happens in the aftermath of this, and again, not perfect in the little details here, but the Puritans are going to take over. This is the moment of Oliver Cromwell establishing basically a Puritan dictatorship over England. He had his new model army and a very effective navy and just is able to establish power. But the reality is England falls into a situation of kind of continuing civil war. Those who were the royalists who supported restoration of the monarch on one side, the Puritans on the other, and the two of them are doing battle through this time, and England is basically in chaos. Cromwell ultimately dies. I think he died from cancer, and that began to take some of the impetus out of the Puritan dictatorship, and ultimately it will fail. There will be a restoration. The restoration monarch was Charles II, and that seems to go okay. I do want to tell you this, that when there was the restoration, there was such an anger against what the Puritans and Cromwell had done that Oliver Cromwell was taken out of his burial, out of his coffin, and publicly beheaded. So they took the corpse and they beheaded the corpse, and they took then the skull with some of the drying skin upon it, and they placed it on a pike, and they left it outside of Westminster Abbey, I think for decades. Just getting darker and darker, and it's tanned by the sun and wizened by the weather, until somebody took pity upon the whole situation and returned the head to the rest of the body in interment. Anyway, clearly, great deal of hostility about exactly what the Puritans and Cromwell had done. Anyway, Charles, his reign goes okay. It's the time of the establishment of, for instance, the Carolinas. Then his, I don't know if it's brother or son, sorry about that, is James II is the next king. And James was also Duke of York, so he was, of course, the founder of New York. But James, it goes bad for James. Again, I can't tell you exactly what's going on, but the situation got bad enough that James decides he's got to make a run for his life, and he takes off, basically. And in England, this became known as the Glorious Revolution, getting rid of the Stuart monarchy or something like that. James will be replaced by William of Orange, William and Mary, and of course that's a college that's named after the two of them in Virginia. William was the monarch of Holland, and really could speak no English at all, and wasn't terribly interested in English issues, but was willing to take over, of course, the monarchy of England. I think Mary was the one who was tied to the English situation. Anyway, and things begin to settle down. And by the time we get to, let's say, 1707, that's 100 years later, the English situation actually is going pretty well. Okay, so there's a reason why the English had neglected them. But the thing is that by the time they get to 1707, it's just like everything seemed to be working just fine the way it was. So the English continued to ignore and neglect the colonies. And that will last until the 1750s, and then for reasons that I will highlight for you just in a little bit here, things are going to change. And the British decide that they need to get involved in the in the colonial situation. And they begin to come in, and they try to rule over the colony, and they try to tax the colonies. And when they do that, of course, this is when the colonists finally decide, that this isn't functional, this is not the way we want to go. So that will ultimately lead, of course, to the breaking with Great Britain. So that's kind of this simple story of why the Americans broke with Great Britain, but you guys know that my job is to make things more confusing and complicated, so I'm going to start to do that now, all right? So what I want to suggest to you is that there is a way of understanding why the Americans broke with Great Britain, and it has to do with what we call historical causation. Historical causation is understanding why things happen in history, and actually it's a way to understand why things actually happen in life. It's intriguing to me that in the issues of causation, we're never really interested in why good things happen. So if someone wins the lottery, they're not going, why did they, no one does that, okay? If you win the lottery, you're going to go, yes, of course I won the lottery. But we more tend to focus on, when things go bad. So when there's a catastrophic outcome, of course, when there's a catastrophe, that's when we want to know why things happen. In fact, right now we're kind of involved in a catastrophic moment, and we definitely want to try to understand as much as we can why that is happening. Anyway, there's a way of kind of understanding this, and causation can be reduced to sort of two general phenomena. One thing is called our structures. These are the latent components of a situation that are just sort of laying there and are the defining nature of what's happening at any given moment. And then there are these things called events. Events are the things that just happen in life that you have really often no control over whatsoever. But it's kind of the nature of life. Our lives are these sort of structures and events. Generally speaking, when we're talking about, of course, historical causation, we're leading to something that is catastrophic. And so we have to assume, of course, that the breaking with Great Britain is catastrophic, and indeed it is catastrophic for the British Empire. But when we look at these things, we tend to focus on the fact that there were what we could call structural flaws. I'm putting my fingers in the wrong place. Structural flaws. These are structural flaws in the colonial environment. So these are the latent problems that were just sort of there and sitting there. And one thing interesting about structural problems is that you could do something about it. You could actually fix the situation. And into this structurally flawed situation will come a series of events. The events will be the ultimate thing that will kind of kick the latent situation into a catastrophic outcome. Now, I just want you to kind of understand what I'm talking about in terms of structure and event. So right now we're in a catastrophic moment, as you know, a pandemic situation, and you could describe this causation in terms of like structure and event. So the structural issue associated with the pandemic is the fact that we have a huge global population, a hugely interconnected global population. So one thing can start like in one place with one person, and yet because of the dynamics of our globe, it can spread all over the place relatively quickly. So, and we've all known that we live in that kind of, the movement of human beings across this planet, they're just extraordinarily rapid, of course. And so before you even know that you might be carrying a virus or something like that, you could have taken it, a far distance to say the least, okay? And then, of course, there has to be an event, and the event occurred in that Chinese city, right? And there's a suggestion that, in a food preparation situation, wild game or something, I remember them describing, of course, just really unhygienic. I think one reporter called it a filthy situation where perhaps, interactions with meat or something like that or wild game allowed for the transfer of a virus. And we already talked about, of course, the great dying, and we know that can occur. It's going to go to one person, from an animal, let's say, to a person, and then from one person to another, So the foundation of the event, of simply that interaction between some human being and something that spread that virus creates the foundation. So we have the structural flaw of a global community, of course, the structural flaw of the connectedness between that global community, and of course then this event that occurred that has led us into this really sort of troubling moment, all right? I must tell you that the foundation of my understanding of this, it's all about earthquakes. That's the way I started. Earthquakes are essentially this manifestation of structure and event. Under California, there are these problems that we call faults, and I love how we use the word fault, right? So it's something wrong, and the something wrong is that this is the boundary of two great plates, the Pacific Plate and the North American Plate. And the intriguing thing, it's a latent problem. It's there. The faults are there, and we can live with them, right? Because they just sort of routinely just sort of sit there. We also know that there's a pressure building essentially, and at some moment then, the plates can slide, the right laterals, strike slips, fault, I think that's the way it's described, can manifest. And when it does, of course, it creates this event called an earthquake, which can be catastrophic. So we have to understand that this is a way of understanding causation, the structural situation and the events that just kind of come into play. And the events are always the unexpected part of the whole thing. I was driving my car one morning down into Riverside on Highway 60, and we're going about 65 miles an hour. It's a slope from Moreno Valley down into Riverside. And this guy's right in front of me, and he blows out his left front tire. And he blew it out, and he just spun around. And all of a sudden, there's this moment where he and I were eyeball to eyeball looking at each other. I'm going 60 miles an hour downhill, and he's forward, and he's going 60 miles an hour downhill backward. And I remember how big his eyes were, and of course, I'm sure that mine were just as large. Just none of us could have expected that situation. And luckily, he just kind of slid over to the side, and then I just kind of was able to maneuver around him. But these are the things that just happen that kind of come out of the blue. So our understanding of why the Americans will break with Great Britain comes under this kind of causation model, that there were structural flaws in the colonial relationship, and that there were these events that will begin to occur that will kick the Americans, kick the whole catastrophic process into gear. In life, it can be just one event that can transform your life. And I'll never forget having a student that was a paratrooper, and he said he jumped out of airplanes 62 times, but on the 63rd time, as he's jumping out of the airplane, something went wrong with the chute, and he's falling to the ground, of course, relatively low-level jump, and falling to the ground, and he's having to forcibly pull his chute out. And he did get his chute out, of course, enough to cushion the blow to the point that he wasn't killed, but he was a paraplegic. He was sitting in my classroom in a kind of wheelchair, and I just remember the incredible impact that just one event can have on an individual's life or something like that. So anyway, the events are the unknown component, of course, and I want to present to you now the structural flaws, and on the essay question this comes off as the long-term problems in the colonial relationship, and then I want to tell you about the events that will actually lead us to the American Revolution, okay? So the primary structural flaws in terms of colonial America have to do with three things. The first is what I'm going to call American strengths. So these were the things that were just strength about America. And it's an ironic situation that what really will lead to the breakup is not that the Americans are problematic, but the Americans are doing so incredibly well at that particular moment. So one thing that I want to highlight to you guys, of course, are these American strengths. Another thing that I'm going to want to highlight to you guys are the fact that the British were extraordinarily weak relative to the Americans. So the Americans are strong, the British are weak, and we'd have to perceive that in a colonial relationship as being a very deeply flawed situation. And then finally, I'm going to want to let you guys know that there were certain attitude problems. And this is simply the way that the British perceived the situation versus the way that the Americans perceived the situation. And these become the essential structural flaws in terms of the colonial relationship. So I'm going to start with the American strengths. So these were things about the Americans that made them very strong, and that's the problem. They were so strong, and technically you would assume that, of course, in a colonial situation, the mother country is strong and the colonies are relatively weak. But in the case of the American colonies were very strong. And I'm kind of reiterating what I've told you before, so like all that becoming American stuff, but trying to refine and nuance it a little bit for you guys. So let me just suggest to you the reasons why the Americans were so strong in terms of the colonial relationship. Now, one thing that made the Americans strong all through this particular period was the fact that they had very good leadership. Very good leadership. This is, just the manifestation essentially of the deferential society that I made a point of. The colonial elites did dominate America, though they dominated, of course, in a relatively gentle way, but they were simply understood to a recognized, respected elite element that more or less ran the colonies in a way that was good for the general colonial population. And these were recognized people. They were skilled in their activities. Basically, over time, of course, they proved themselves to be very effective leaders, and we know their names. They're George Washington and John Adams and Sam Adams and Patrick Henry and Thomas Jefferson, etc. All these people. And the proof kind of, to me, is in the pudding, that they were good at leading the colonies, they were good at leading the protests, they were good at leading the rebellion, and they were ultimately good at leading the revolution and the establishment of the United States of America. So one thing that clearly allowed the Americans, to be strong in the colonial relationship was that they had a really good leadership cadre that was sort of guiding them through all these particular issues. Another thing that allowed the Americans to be relatively strong was that they had what we call centers of authority. Now, centers of authority is a pretty simple concept, to be honest with you. It just simply means that they had towns and cities and places that they could go to get the information that they needed. And this was like Boston and New York and Philadelphia and Charleston and smaller towns too that were available. But you always need some place to go to find out what's going on. And you'll see that when we talk about, as the movement is towards the actual revolution, so many of these events are occurring in places like Boston. Boston is the center point and the flashpoint of so much of what's going to lead to the revolution, basically. So having these centers of authority simply meant that there was always somewhere where you could go to get the important information that you needed. A second thing that they had, or another third thing I should say, was that they had what we call institutions of authority. Institutions of authority is basically a kind of sophisticated way of saying that they were virtually self-governing. They had local government, they had what we call town meetings, they had county governments, and they had what we call the charismatic governing apparatus of colonial America, and that was the colonial assemblies. The colonial assemblies were what I already told you, that they believed in representative government. The colonial assemblies were the government that they believed in. And I'm absolutely convinced that if you ever asked a colonist, just said to them, a question about the government, just don't say anything other than that, just, what do you think about the government? They would say, they think you're talking about the colonial assembly. They don't think about the king. They don't think about parliament. They think about their own assembly. So what this means is the colonists were virtually self-governing. And the problem is, that that's not the way colonies should be. Colonies should be ruled by the mother country, and yet that simply wasn't the way it was, really, as far as the colonies are concerned. Finally, I have two more, sorry about that. Another strength of colonial America was the politicized nature of the colonists, or if you want, politicization. I do believe that the colonists were probably the most politicized people in the entire world. And so the question is, what does politicization mean? It means that they were politically astute, that they were politically aware, that they were politically active. It was one of the stunning things the British found out the hard way. When they tried to do things to the Americans figured it out like in a heartbeat. And they hit the streets and they protested and they were active just from the very beginning. So all of these are simply indication of the politicized nature. I'm convinced that the Americans were the most politicized people in the entire world. So that means that they are astute and active and aware and able to do stuff in a kind of profound way. And then finally, the thing that of course becomes the foundation really of the strength of America was that it had what I'm going to call the social and economic competence. So what this means, of course, is that they had the population base, they had a social structure, they had a very strong economy to say the least. They had printing presses, they had newspapers, they had colleges, they had everything they needed to be an independent country. And that's the problem, right? They are functioning as if they are a self-governing independent country, even in the moment, of course, that they were colonies. And we would have to perceive this, at least in terms of the colonial relationship, as a structurally flawed city. It's wonderful for Americans. It means that they're ready to go on their own. But for the colonial relationship and the relationship with Great Britain, these are all significant problems, okay? Another major structural flaw in the colonial situation were the fact that the British were so incredibly weak in this relationship. Now, I do want you to know that you can't say that Great Britain was weak. That just doesn't function, essentially, at this time, okay? The British were becoming the most powerful country in the entire world. But I'm sure you guys know that there is that weird sort of situation where you can be strong in one way and relatively weak in another. So you could be like the President of the United States, we've seen this in like movies and stuff, but you can't manage your own daughter. Or you're the head of a major corporation, but your kids are running amok or something like that. So in some ways you can be strong, and in other ways you can be weak. And relative to the colonists, the British were basically weak, okay? So I'm going to suggest you, the components of the British weakness. So here we go. I'm going to use this, I'm going to see, everything says almost no. So what I'm doing is I'm exaggerating essentially. So it's not exactly that, but trying to make the point, okay? So the British had almost no bureaucratic power over the colonies. They never created an agency of the colonies. They never created a ministry of the colonies. They had something called the Board of Trade, but the Board of Trade basically was a joke. It was the thing that was supposed to run the navigation acts, so that, wasn't anything at all. There was really only one major player in the colonies who represented the British government, and those were the royal governors. And you would think the royal governors would be, have some relative power, but they came to America and they ran into the strength of the colonial assemblies, and the reality was, they couldn't challenge it. And they sort of just, some of them tried, some of them fought back, and they failed. So most of them just realized it was, a no-go. And so they would simply come, put in their time, get it on their resume for their next, really look forward to another job someplace else, because there was nothing good about being a colonial governor. But we have virtually no administrative power of the British as far as the colonies are concerned. The British also had virtually no coercive power. So coercive power is the power to force people to do things, and it manifests in such things as law enforcement. And the law enforcement of the colonies was in the hands of the colonists. They were the sheriffs. They were the people that were taking care of law enforcement issues and running the society, basically. And the British had virtually no police power as far as the colonies were concerned. The other larger manifestation of coercive power, of course, is the military. And yes, there were some redcoats in America. That number will jump dramatically when we get to the 1750s. And there was always the British Navy kind of hovering off there to the side, out in the ocean. But the reality was that the primary military power of the colonies was in the hands of the colonists themselves. And it was the militia. The militia was technically all able-bodied men between the age of 16 and 60. And, they would be required to come on any kind of emergency situation. Routinely, they would get together like once a month and do a little bit of marching and a little bit of, maneuvering and stuff like that, just to keep themselves in shape. And they would also, the primary objective routinely was simply protection against the Native Americans, But the military power of the colonies was in the hands of the colonists. That's what I've been trying to tell you. The colonists, of course, are kind of dominating the show. We also have a situation where there is virtually no communication. Now, this is an exaggeration for sure. There was communication between the Americans and the British, but it was never regular. There was no structure to it whatsoever. It's not till, I think, 1755, until the British decided that they needed a ship that just went back and forth to guarantee that there would be communications. Before that, it was all happenstance. You would simply find a sea captain who was going to Great Britain at some point and give them a letter. And so, just to give you a sense of how this would work out, let's say the Massachusetts General Assembly's got a problem. They need an answer from Parliament. They write a letter to Parliament. They go down to the wharf. They find a ship who's going to ultimately get to Great Britain. But the captain goes to the Caribbean. Then he goes over somewhere here. He goes there. He finally gets to Great Britain like 7 months later. I should use 6 months to make it around you. 6 months later. And, the letter then gets to Parliament, and Parliament will respond to it. But then they've got to find someone who will take it back. And they find another sea captain. He's going to go here, there, and everywhere. And, let's just say that it finally gets back, it's a year later. Now, you guys know that if you ask me a question today and I answer you the question a year from today, you're going to go, what the heck? You won't even remember that you asked the question. So, here's the thing to me. They didn't know what was going on. And if they didn't know what was going on, they were not in control. And that's just the way it was that time. So, the British had virtually no communication with the colonies. And then finally, the British were becoming increasingly economically dependent upon the colonies. The colonies represented 40% of British overseas trade. 40%, that's a big chunk of their overseas trade. And the thing that I think is most interesting to me is that, the British needed the Americans more than the Americans needed them. And clearly that, it's a sign of weakness. And by the way, the British did need them. They're not going to fight just one, but 2 wars to maintain control over the colonies. The first is the French and Indian War, and the second was the American Revolution. So, clearly they wanted the colonies. They needed them, and they needed them much more so than the Americans needed the British. So this creates another structural flaw. The Americans are so strong, essentially, and the British are so weak as far as the relationship is concerned. Finally, in terms of the structural flaws or long-term issues and long-term problems in the colonial relationship, I'm going to suggest this one. I'm going to call it attitude problems. So this is the way that the British perceived this situation and the relationship, and it's also the way that the Americans perceived it. And both of them, were problematic in their attitudes towards this, to say the least. And they're kind of like ships passing in the night, where neither one of them really understood what the other one was thinking. So first of all, I want to just deal with Great Britain. Now, one thing that I don't know if you've noticed, it's a subtle situation, but when I started talking, even at this moment, I talked about England. But by the time we get to the 1750s, we've got to start saying Great Britain. And the reason is because the English ultimately would gain control over all the British Isles. It was the Romans who originally described the entire area as Magna Britannia, or Great Britain, and that was, of course, the entire area of the British Isles, essentially. And there were historically, traditionally, 4 kingdoms in this area. One was England, one was Wales, one was Scotland, and the last was Ireland. And what happened was the English were always kind of the dominant element of this, and they quickly began to gain control over Wales. The Prince of Wales is second in line for the throne, and then with the accession of James I, James was actually James VII, King of Scotland. Then Scotland comes into the fold, and I must tell you that I do not know exactly how it happened, but at some point Ireland is taken over also, and the Irish became sort of the tragically abused cousins of this situation, becoming part of what we know as Great Britain. So by the time you get to 1750, it's inappropriate really to say just England. It is increasingly now Great Britain. So that's my half an hour situation. I'm going to finish this point and then I will timer off. Oh, is that what you do? Okay. Anyway, I'll finish this little point and I'll do my break. Anyway, the British are now becoming, it is Great Britain, it makes sense. But the thing that I like to suggest to you, it's not just, Great Britain in name, but Great Britain kind of in reality. The British are emerging as the superpower of the moment. By the time we get to 1750, we're really being able to see this. They're a vast merchant marine, all the cargo ships traveling all over the world. They had the largest navy in the world. Britannia ruled the waves, and increasingly, that was something that was an absolute in terms of the high seas, basically. They had, of course, a strong general military apparatus. They had a strong governing apparatus. Their economy was very strong and steeped in overseas trade and increasingly across the entire globe. They were beginning to embark upon the Industrial Revolution, which would give them a fundamental edge over everybody else in the entire world. In the 19th century, the British are the superpower of that moment in no uncertain terms. They developed a huge overseas empire. I'm sure you guys have heard something about that. So the British were not, it's not Great Britain only in name, but Great Britain in reality, basically. And with that, of course, the British began to develop a kind of arrogance, that they were better than everybody. They're better than, of course, all the Europeans around them, but they're better than the Americans. And so you have the British perceiving themselves as being this extraordinarily powerful entity, of course. And of course, it colors their attitudes towards the colonists. And the way that I want to present this to you, what I'm going to call it, if I can separate these papers, I'm going to call it the illusion of control. So what I mean by that is that the British began to simply create a fiction in their minds. And that fiction was that they were in charge of the colonies, this illusion of control. They couldn't believe that they weren't in charge. It was sort of like in their arrogance, they could only think that had to be the way it was. So they did not recognize their weaknesses. And of course, they didn't recognize the strengths of the Americans in any kind of way. And so I'm going to call it the illusion of control. And I do want you to know that it is an illusion. The reality was that the British never had controlled the colonies, and they never will. They simply will never control them. When they try to make an effort to control them, the end result of that, of course, is the Americans will be moving towards independence. So the British simply, there's this arrogant attitude, and that creates the foundation of this illusion of control. Now, the Americans had an attitude problem too, you could say. They were feeling pretty good about themselves. They absolutely admired the British. I don't want you to think that. The science of the British, the literature of the British, the power of the British, all of that was tremendously impressive, to say the least. And the Americans would routinely, of course, drink the health of the king and all that kind of stuff, because there was just a feeling that this was, a linkage, of course, and a cultural, economic, otherwise, that in some ways they were very proud of. But they also had a feeling, their attitude problem was that they wanted to be left alone. So I'm going to call it, I should say non-interference here. A notion of non-interference. They loved the British as long as the British left them the hell alone, as long as they didn't interfere. And of course, that illusion of control from the British point of view is going to be problematic, and that the British think that they can control the situation. And in the end, of course, that's going to cause some serious problems. So one of the critical things that's leading to the American Revolution, this catastrophic outcome, were structural flaws in the colonial relationship. The other one is, I'll get to in just a bit here, of course, are the events that will ultimately kick the sucker into gear. And I'm going to take my break right now, okay?